Imagine a fighter jet that never entered combat yet killed more than 100 pilots. It was so bad that they called it the Widowmaker. Or how about a fighter jet that is so odd-looking and hard to fly, pilots hated it, not due to its ugly looks, but because it also kept crashing before takeoff. Some fighter jets looked so great on paper and ended up being disasters that the US military simply asked for replacement. Numerous others never lived up to expectations and were simply turned into escorts and training planes. There are more of these horrible fighter jets than we can list today, so we'll just stick to a few that sort of stand out from the crowd. So let's take a look at some of the most failed fighter jets of all time. Before we hit the list of lame fighter jets, let's try to make sense of why so many promising planes failed. The realm of fighter jets wasn't always decorated with Super Hornets, MiG-35s, and F-16s. Some of the earliest designs were just flying coffins because they were either too slow with low maneuverability and thus sitting ducks, or just crashed on a regular basis, and in some cases even before taking off. And even though the Americans and Russians spent insane sums of money on developing and deploying thousands of fighter jets during the Cold War, and they still do, all that money resulted in merely a handful of truly superior, effective, fast, and maneuverable jets. One of the reasons for the many failures had to do with time. Both the East and West were in a rush to make the fastest and best plane, so as a result, most designs were flawed. They raced towards the sound barrier but didn't invest enough time and effort in understanding how the engines and airframes would react to higher speeds and greater stresses. In the end, they never engaged in any direct wars, and the trillions of dollars spent turned out to be nothing more or less than a waste of money. Well, except for those who got really rich. The two sides were so focused on stealing each other's technological secrets and even scientists, and thus didn't bother to invest enough in innovating into originality, which later proved to be king. Mind you that if there was no rush and so much paranoia going around, we would have had F-22 Raptors and MiG-35s as far back as the mid-1960s. Let's start in the East with the Yak-38, which was interestingly built out of jealousy. When the Soviets developed the Yak-38, their goal was not to create a superior strike fighter jet, but rather prove to the West that the British were not the only ones who could make fighter jets with vertical takeoff and landing capabilities. The story began in 1967, when everyone was intrigued when they saw the plane vertically take off and land from aircraft carriers. By January 1971, the Soviet-made Yak-38 was up and running, and by 1976, it was deployed but almost exclusively on Soviet Kiev-class aircraft carriers. Later models such as the Yak-38U, 34, and Yak-38M, 52 were introduced as upgrades, but still the plane wasn't good even though a total of 231 were made and continued to serve until 1991. It was not the worst fighter jet ever made, but it was widely hated by airmen and generals alike because its range was lousy and its armament was less than impressive. The reason behind these issues was the need to make the plane light, so the designers removed the radar and reduced fuel capacity, leaving the Yak with a short range and pathetic combat capability. The maker sort of knew these flaws, and to make it more attractive, even though it was easy to shoot down, they equipped it with a superior automatic ejector seat, which made pilots feel a little better flying it. Our next lousy fighter jet on the list is the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger, which made its maiden flight in late 1953, entered service in 1956, and retired in 1971. About 1,000 of these flying interceptor coffins were built, and no one liked them. It was designed and produced by the American aircraft manufacturer Convair. It represented the first American operational supersonic interceptor operated by the United States Air Force. Its main purpose was to be the backbone of American air defenses and to intercept approaching Soviet strategic bomber fleets, primarily the Tupolev Tu-95, during the Cold War. The whole West was freaking out from the Russian bomber Tupolev Tu-95, which is still a nightmare to this day and will continue to serve the Russian army until 2040. So rushing a fighter jet able to quickly intercept and shoot it was a necessity. For its time, the F-102 did feature a decent, sophisticated fire control system. However, it was also sort of bad from the start, because the first plane crashed a mere 9 days after its maiden flight. The only reason they pushed forward with the program was because the Cold War was heating up quickly and the Russians were ahead. This plane was so stubborn, no matter what the engineers did, it just wouldn't hit Mach 1 or 1,235 km per hour, which defeated its purpose as an interceptor because the Tupolev Tu-95 was able to travel at the speed of 925 km per hour. In the end, the engineers realized that its engine and aerodynamic design were flawed, and the plane was suffering from a phenomenon called transonic drag. Several major redesigns only resulted in minor improvements in performance, and in 1957, the Air Force got so sick of the countless changes to the F-102 that they basically asked for a new airplane. The next disaster fighter jet on our list is the Vought F7U Cutlass, which is sort of ancient because the first plane made its maiden flight in September 1948, entered service in 1951, and retired fairly soon in 1959. A total of 320 Vought F7U Cutless were built and mainly deployed on U.S. aircraft carriers. It was the first tailless production fighter in the United States, as well as the Navy's first jet equipped with swept wings, and the first to be designed with afterburners. Much of the plane's design was influenced by information obtained from Nazi Germany. The design was odd, while the Westinghouse J-34 turbojet engines powering it were weak, and its hydraulic flight control system was unreliable, which turned it into a crash machine. Even the improved models, such as the F7U 1 and 2, were still bad and just as ugly. We say ugly because, unlike the sleek fighter jets of other nations, the F7U Cutless had a peculiar raised nose to accommodate its complex and unreliable landing gear that frequently collapsed during carrier deck landings. This meant the plane often crashed while on the runway. This plane was so bad that it killed more than 30 pilots during peacetime in a very short period. And more than a quarter of all units ever made crashed and injured many pilots and Marines working on carrier decks. The next flying coffin on our list is none other than the infamous British de Havilland Sea Vixen, which entered service in 1959. The Sea Vixen was yet another ugly British twin-engine, twin-boom-tailed, two-seat, carrier-based fleet air defense fighter flown by the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm from 1959 to early 1970. It was the first British two-seat combat aircraft to achieve supersonic speed, albeit not in level flight. What was really messed up about this fighter jet is the fact that 38% of all units ever made crashed in accidents, not combat. It featured a curious design with the pilot occupying an offset cockpit. It was also notorious for its tricky handling issues. We can only guess that the British hung on to it for a decade because it was their first indigenous two-seat combat aircraft to achieve supersonic speed. It killed around 55 British airmen, sometimes while still on the runway. So it was horrific, and the pilots were scared more of it than the Soviets. In the end, all of these failures led to the creation of amazing fighter jets that, interestingly, mostly came after the end of the Cold War, such as the Super Hornet, the F-22 Raptor, the MiG-35, and the Sukhoi Su-57. Thank you for watching, and please do let us know your opinion in the comments section. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon.